Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending in such numbers on what is clearly such a slow news day. But welcome to the launch of Strategic Survey 2019, our Annual Assessment of Geopolitics. We think that at a time of heightened geopolitical competition and clearly structural change in the international system, it is more important than ever that we take the opportunity to look at the past year and to focus our attention amid a welter of events on what strategically has changed. I'm joined today by three colleagues, Dr. Kori Schake, Deputy Director General of the IISS, Nigel Inkster, our Senior Advisor, and Dr. Nicholas Redman, the Distinguished Editor of Strategic Survey. And I'll begin with some general remarks on the state of the international order before handing over to them, and then we and our colleagues in the front row will take your questions. The trends of 2018, 2019 have all confirmed the atomization of international society. Neither balance of power nor international rules-based governance serve as ordering principles. International institutions have been marginalized. The diplomatic routine of meetings continues, yet the competing exertions of national efforts, too often rarely coordinated with others, matter more, and most often they are erratic in both execution and consequence. Almost all international strategic issues of importance, whether the Middle East peace process, the conflict in Ukraine, or the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, are either in a constant state of feckless negotiation or artificially and dangerously frozen. Outcomes are fleeting, partial, and then subject to review. There is no predictable rhythm to international affairs. The disruptors carry most of the advantage. Those clinging to the status quo are losing their grip. The US is pricing itself out of alliance politics, complaining that its European allies contribute too little and seeking to charge its Asian allies multiples of what they now pay for Asian American bases. China is advancing a model of development through its Belt and Road Initiative that is intended to ensure more states stand with it or are usefully neutral. Some small powers feel horribly squeezed by these pressures. Others have gained disproportionate bargaining power. Still others are able to carry out ruthless domestic policies in the sure knowledge that there is no effective international community willing or able to check their excesses. In time, some new order will emerge, but the indications are that politically and possibly technologically, the world will simply divide into separate ecosystems with their own rules and customs. Perhaps power will accrue to those who can navigate best between them, lead effective networks in the absence of institutions, and build coalitions when alliances have withered. The evolving world order is not likely to mimic past power shifts. If the Pax Americana is ending, that does not mean that a Pax Sinica is beginning. China is rising with its own characteristics and sense of purpose, and into an environment where power is subtly diffused. It will perhaps hold sway over more countries and have a wider array of political relationships, but it is neither in its diplomatic style nor in its power to have the sort of cooperative alliance relationships that the US developed in the past. For its part, the US is not likely to pass any strategic baton to China. The shifts will be more tectonic than sudden. As this happens, other countries will assert their national interests with greater force, sensing rightly that there is less resistance to their unilateral impulses. The US and China, and to a degree the EU, Iran, and Russia, will aim to retain power in their neighborhoods. Yet the operation of sphere of influence politics will be difficult for modern-day geopoliticians. Nationalist impulses create antibodies to foreign clout and force projection. An atomized world order is resistant to tutelage from afar. This is true no matter how compelling the ideology and model of governance promoted by ambitious states. Gray zone warfare has become prominent in this contested environment where the realities and perceptions of the distribution of power are shifting. It is striking how much the soft power of the US and Europe has shrunk. Their ability to project power and inspire positive change has dramatically receded. At the height of US post-war power in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the US and some of its allies made an effort not just to support democracy where it existed, but to promote it where it was absent. This was done on the strategic judgment that more democracies in the world would increase compliance with the rules-based order as a natural consequence without external enforcement. However, democracies proved difficult to install. Elections in countries with limited prior experience of democratic values often invested illiberal leaders with power, and authoritarian regimes came to see real or imagined support by the West for color revolutions as an assault on their rules and governance models that required a vigorous response. As nationalism and populist policies have taken hold in several key Western states, the appetite for extrovert foreign policies has receded, and so has the will to defend the international rule of law. Western military power remains impressive, but it is not harnessed cooperatively, as shown by the difficulty in late summer 2019 in mounting a formal maritime coalition to defend commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. More importantly, the political authority once assumed as a matter of right by Western states, and so often conferred on them by those who lived under different systems, has been greatly depleted. Military strength and technical prowess, divorced from political reputation and moral authority, are commensurately weaker and less effective. The rise of populist politics in the US and in a number of EU countries has consumed political attentions. It has rendered introvert and self-obsessed states that were previously open in outlook and guided by a notion of enlightened self-interest. These states are less interested today in promoting new rules or norms of behavior. Rather, they are focused on maintaining their own national and regional orders relatively intact. The main adherents to a rules-based order are in countries more used to following than leading. In a world that is fragmenting, powers such as Russia, Iran, and China will strive to rewrite the rules in their own regions, but will not find the going all smooth. Russia will not always have its way in Eurasia. Iran will not control the Persian Gulf uncontested. China will discover that others in Asia will not pay it automatic tribute. Both South Africa and Nigeria accept Africa's reluctance to acknowledge a continental overseer, and the US is struggling to uphold its Monroe Doctrine in Venezuela. For its part, Europe is finding its near abroad coming uncomfortably close to its own borders as people and instability migrate north from Africa and the Levant. A global rules-based order, to the degree that it was ever established, is now clearly deposited in the memory banks of Western strategic nostalgia. Much the same can be said of international law, now so honored in the breach rather than in the observance that it cannot make a credible claim to global force. When law cannot settle disputes, they are shunted back to the political realm for resolution. As compliance with international law shrinks, those who command the most political power will make the rules. International law may cease to have true international pretensions. Universality then cedes to regionalism. The separate regional political orders and internet ecosystems might then be replicated in separate international legal arrangements. A global rules-based order may in time be reestablished. That will only happen with the determined application of statecraft rather than by the earnest convening of international summits. The process will be competitive, upsetting, draining, and dynamic. The questions are, whose rules will they be, and how many different orders might they govern? And that is the international strategic competition foretold in the events of 2018-2019 that we think will play out in the coming years and which we anticipate in this year's excellent edition of Strategic Survey. Let's add a few thoughts to those general reflections and invite Kori Schake first to say a few words on the US security establishment's view of China in these circumstances. Kori.
So I love this book because it draws these pungent themes out so sharply. And my favorite thing about the International Institute for Strategic Studies is that we care about big ideas and we argue vociferously about them. So I just start by saying that I think we overstate almost all of the trends that we're talking about in this, and that I, for example, think, wow, the Monroe Doctrine's always been difficult, and if we were so good at it before 2018, how has Cuba remained outside American influence all this time? So I love the way this book frames issues and takes sharp judgments on them, because it helps all of us wrestle intellectually with what are big, important issues about the shape of the international order and what is occurring now that is different than previously. I've been asked to talk about US views on China, which I do think is genuinely different and of systemic importance. I can't remember a time when the United States didn't have conflicting views about China. US policy since at least the last 3 presidents, and probably since 1973, has been based on the fundamental belief that as China became more prosperous, its citizens would become more demanding political consumers, and that the Chinese Communist Party leadership would permit the liberalization of the system, and that would be enabled and encouraged by allowing China to participate preferentially in many of the institutions and practices that they were not wholly compliant with. And what I think is different is that China's behavior, especially in the last 25 years, has finally caused a reconsideration of those views on the part of the American establishment writ large. So it's not just the national security community that says, hey, China's not playing by the rules, and if we don't reset this relationship, China will soon be so strong that it can set different rules, and we're not going to like those rules. It's not just the national security community. The experience of American businesses operating in China has soured. Many of you may have heard Mark Zuckerberg testifying on Capitol Hill yesterday, extremely dour about the prospects for any kind of business for Facebook and other tech companies in China. Even the trade community is darkening in their judgments about China. So there is literally no capital to be gained in the American political system by being pro-China right now. And different sectors of the American establishment are competing for who can be tougher on forcing China to play by the rules that others play by. You see this in the notion of reciprocity for diplomats and scholars. You see it in trying to reset the trade relationship, as erratic as President and odd as President Trump's choices are for that, and a very strong consolidation on the part of the national security community that China is not playing by the rules, is endangering an international order that has been advantageous not just to others but also to the United States.
Kori, thank you very much. Nigel, maybe a few words on China's view of the global order.
Well, yes, indeed. At the end of your presentation, John, you said that maybe a new global order will in due course emerge. And I think it is certainly the case that China has aspirations and to shape that global order and ideas about how to do it. One of the key themes that you find in a lot of Chinese writings on international relations at the moment is this idea that the world is in a period of global change that is unprecedented in the last 100 years. And I think underlying this is a deeply rooted belief that the United States and the West generally are in a period of irreversible decline, and that it is now China's turn, to take center stage. And of course, if you are a Marxist, then the future is abundantly clear to you. It's only the past that is so distressingly unpredictable. It's quite clear now that what we see now in terms of the relationship between the United States and China, which is likely to be the defining strategic relationship in the world for some while to come, is something that goes way beyond the purely commercial and trade. That is simply a symptom of a much wider malaise, which is about a competition for values, ideology, and at the end of the day, geopolitical power. And perhaps worth looking at briefly the kind of thinking that's been going on in China, because certainly during the 1990s, a period of relative intellectual liberalization, we saw a lot of different political ideas being advanced and argued about, try and work out where China should go and what the implications of its rapid economic development would be. We had everything from neoliberalism right through to neo-Maoism. But in this battle of ideas, the people who got the leadership's ear are a group that I think might be best referred to as neo-statists. People like Wang Huning, who is now a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, Jiang Shigong, Hu Angang, the economist and also the architect of China's current policies in Xinjiang. And these guys, who are actually drawing on a lot of Western intellectual thinking in their analysis, argued for political sovereignty over the rule of law, Chinese exceptionalism, the single-party state as the optimum model for a development that mitigates the rampant inequality that we saw emerging in the 1990s. It goes even further than that, because one of the architects, one of these neo-statists, wrote an essay in the Chinese intellectual website, Sixiang, a few months ago. This was Jiang Shigong. And the question he posed was, is imperialism really so bad? And his response was, well, not if it's imperialism with Chinese characteristics. And I'm not kidding. So, I mean, China is developing or advocating for a reform of global governance based on a Chinese model that seeks to link up with Confucian traditional statecraft concepts of Tianxia, all under heaven, the idea of an entire human community being governed by an enlightened ruler who enjoys the mandate of heaven. And so what China is saying is that its ideas for global governments, which can be summed up in this term, a community of common destiny for mankind, is inherently morally superior to that which the Western powers developed in the post-World War II era. And China is arguing that the Western models of global governance are simply failing to address the major challenges that the world faces, whether it's things like transnational terrorism, whether it's financial stability, whether it's climate change. Basically, the Western institutions, Western models are simply not capable of addressing adequately these issues. And what is the community of common destiny for mankind? Well, it is very much a work in progress, but there is a lot of work being done by institutions across China looking at what is involved here. But I think what it boils down to, in essence, is the following. Firstly, it would be a system in which the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party was no longer open to challenge. It would be a world in which other states recognized and internalized China's priorities and red lines on pain of sanction for failing to do so. And, to pick up on another theme in John's presentation, it would be a world in which international customary law is subordinated to the interests of major powers, for which read China. I think, in practice, I don't think that the Chinese party state believes that this is going to be an easy thing to introduce. And indeed, they see the US system as the major barrier to doing this. The USA becomes the strategic other in this contest. And I think it's also worth highlighting the fact that there are plenty of people within China who have reservations about this whole approach. And we saw this earlier in the year when the US-China trade dispute really hotted up. And there were many articles in this Chinese state-sponsored media attacking those who advocated for accommodation with the United States and approach that focused less on contestation and more on fixing some of China's own problems. So I don't think it is by any means a foregone conclusion that this approach is going to carry the day. But we should not be in any doubt that it is a serious, well-thought-out strategy. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the primary vehicle for delivering this strategy. And it is an approach that certainly deserves to be taken seriously. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you very much. Nick on Russia.
Thank you. I thought I would say a few words on Russia's view of global order, but Russia is one of those countries where the domestic politics matter greatly to the external posture, so I thought I'd start inside and then move out, but promise to do so in 4 minutes, and then it's your turn. So, as with China, Russia is on the same page as regards to the idea of Western decline. It's also on the same page with regard to the idea of colour revolutions. Russia got there first. The idea that Western states are exploiting fissures in society to change the nature of regimes that they don't like. I mean, these early cases were, of course, all in the former Soviet Union. In Georgia, 2003, Ukraine, 2004, Kyrgyz Republic not far after that. So we'll look to Western publics like an outbreak of democratic exuberance. Look to Russia, a country with a history of both being subverted and subverting others, as something very different. It looked like a case of hybrid war, a term that the Russians have always regarded as a Western concept and something that the West was practicing years before Crimea ever happened. The achievement of these fundamental objectives by non-military means, tapping the protest potential of the population. Thereafter, of course, the ouster of Saddam Hussein showed that the West was still capable of much more direct and kinetic means, but the Arab Spring underlined to Russia again the potency of the concept of cover revolutions. But it also underlined to them in the sense that the West, even as they were in decline, even as they were clinging on by their fingernails to preserve their hegemony, would stop at nothing to push this regime change agenda, and that the Kremlin was ultimately the target of that. So over the last several years, we've seen a multifaceted policy response in Russia. At home, expanding controls on civil society, the effort to roll back a lot of the Western funding and support for these civil society institutions, and Western sanctions have actually helped in this regard. And then in the last year or so, sustained consideration of ways to develop a sovereign internet if Russia, one that can then live independently of the rest of the system, and to de-dollarize the economy where possible. Abroad, Russia has looked to tap some of those same social vulnerabilities that it believed that Western states did so well in the color revolutions. It cannot topple governance, but it can sow division, it can sow mistrust and cynicism, and the aim is to distract, deflate, and disorient. So Russia's view of global order, in one way, is quite simply back to the future. It wants a multipolar world where the declining West no longer calls the shots, no longer dominates the institutions. Russia lacks the muscle that China has to remake the world, to re-engineer these institutions. It can't do a BRI. So it is focused instead, I'd suggest to you, on two other aspects. The first is a rejection in the international security realm of Western overreach. So Russia is steadfast in its rejection of rights of intervention. It upholds the sovereignty of states and the principle of non-interference, even where occasionally in its own neighborhood it goes the other way. Hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. And it insists on the primacy of the Security Council, where, of course, Russia and China both have vetoes. But there's another aspect to this, and that's Russia's effort, wherever it can now, to bury liberalism. Liberalism, which it regards as a mortal threat to Russia's own sovereign democracy. Hence, the defense of difference when Russia is talking abroad, group rights over individual rights, and an adherence and an espousal of traditional values at pretty much every turn. And I suppose we could include in that also non-interference and poking noses and eyes too closely into the conduct of elections abroad. Now, it's an offer that Putin has taken to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, and he's found a sympathetic audience in many countries. There is, in short, a values gap. This is not the Cold War, but there is an ideological edge to this that I don't think we can any longer deny. So, Russia is acting to secure its interests, to accelerate the decline of the West where it can, or at least decline of its hegemony, and to bring forward a multipolar world. I think in these circumstances, in the Russian perception, a peaceful coexistence with the liberal West is scarcely possible. So if the Italian, French, and American presidents or leaders could actually persuade their other four members of the G7 to recreate the G8 and bring Russia back into it, I have serious doubt over whether Putin would actually accept the offer. G7 is the past. G8 was a promise that actually now looks to them like a con. G20 looks much more like the future, and it's an organization within, I think, the Russian leadership can feel much more confident.
Nick, thank you very much. Questions, comments, happy to have a conversation and to include some of our people from the front. Yes, you, sir, first. If you could stand up and the microphone will arrive. If you could give us your name and affiliation if relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, Samir Puri, academic at King's College and Johns Hopkins. Dr. Schake, you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg, so I guess that means his attempts to learn Mandarin might be over. I was wondering about future battles for internet governance between the major powers and the extent to which you've looked at the strategic implications of those sorts of battles and what they might look like.
Yeah, so we at the Institute are looking at it in several different arenas. We are doing a big project in our geoeconomics program on the Belt and Road Initiative, and in particular, one strain of that looks at China's effort to create a digital Belt and Road, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that separately. In the strategic survey, we, Nick, please correct me if I am mistaken, but we focus more on trade and geopolitics than we focus on standard setting. But you are exactly right that this issue of standard setting really matters, and it matters in the intelligence cooperation among in particular, the Five Eyes states. It matters in all of us getting an education on the way we are allowing ease of doing business to drive strategic choices on privacy and on standards in the digital realm. But Nick, maybe you should speak to this rather than me.
Thank you. I mean, just one small point on that about standard settings. So there is an essay in there about 5G. And if you look at the data on standard setting, what's interesting within these different generations of mobile telephony, the share of China in patents. And it's gone up and up and up. And it doubled between 2G, 3G, it doubled 3G to 4G, and 5G, admittedly, this is a race that's still being run, but 5G now, it looks like, depending on which data set you did, either China is level pegging or is actually in top place when you put Huawei ZTE together. So, I mean, that's hugely important because, are we, Western states now have a choice. Are they actually going to collaborate with China or try and shut China out? And so that's one of the big standard setting competitions that we're talking about, and it's a theme that John highlighted for you in his initial remarks.
Thanks. In the third row, yes, if you could stand up, then the microphone can more easily identify you. Thank you.
Excuse me, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement...
Bring the microphone further away.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Former law enforcement intelligence analyst, mainly worked in ex-Soviet states, but also in BRI states, Pakistan and East Africa. My question is two sections. There's no mention, very, very little mention has been made by you of the Europeans in all this, and I suspect there's good, or should we say bad reasons. Do you see the Europeans in any way expanding upon the somewhat stuttering efforts on PESCO to leverage this into geopolitical and technical clout alongside the US, not in competition to the US, but alongside the US,
okay, we have
to
the
put
first
a
question.
front?
We've got the first question. Bastian Giegowitz, who's the director of our Defense and Military Analysis Program and a German national, if that helps. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Quickly on the Europeans and PESCO and how that might all line up. I think the first thing to remember is that most Europeans only recently woke up to the kinds of challenges that we have just described here on the panel. When you look at PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defense, of which there are now more than 30 projects, I think what you can see is that they're all rather bitty and small, and they do not add up to a strategic approach of the kind you, I think, implied in your question. I think it's also fair to say that PESCO's funding is limited in itself, and the European problem is the usual one where if everybody does their small bits, all these small bits never add up to a large whole, and you don't get the scale to matter in the conversation that has been had here. I think, though, from a defense point of view, the challenge that you can probably read into a lot of the remarks today is that while a lot of Europeans are, in the immediate term, focused on strengthening deterrence and defense vis-à-vis Russia, there's a long-term challenge that has to do with containing China, and the book talks about that as well, where Europeans are not yet up to speed. I think it is interesting that NATO is beginning a conversation about these themes, but it's very much in the early stages of making an assessment of what it might have to do, and much further away from making decisions.
Thank you very much. Yes. Go ahead.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. Going back to Russia, I'm extremely disappointed that President Putin was given such a warm welcome in Riyadh, especially after we have supported MBS in the aftermath of Jamal Khashoggi. We have proved to be great allies of Saudi Arabia, and I almost think it was a betrayal of our support that he's going to Russia. How do the Russians see this? I mean, the Russians see this, I've spoken to Russian diplomats, they see this as a win-win-win situation for them, especially with Syria. And I find it so sad that President Trump says to the Kurds as he leaves, they're 7,000 miles away, they'll do great. I mean, America is such an important ally of ours, and we look to them for leadership. I mean, Europe is wondering, where is our leadership going? And I'm really worried even in 2020. I was with some American friends this weekend, and they said, we think President Trump is going to be re-elected because there's so much disarray in the Democrat camp, and these were partly Democrats speaking.
So your question is about the US?
And Russia.
The US and Russia. Let me start with Nick and then come back to Kori.
Well, I think you've touched on one of Russia's advantages, that cooperation tends to be no strings cooperation. You want to buy some tanks, you can buy some tanks, and there's not going to be much talk about what your domestic arrangements are, which, you know, for the Saudis was ultimately an issue with Khashoggi, and the sanctions followed and the condemnation followed. So for me, this is actually emblematic of a broader advantage that some of these authoritarian states have. They don't care about being prescriptive. And because they don't care about being prescriptive, it's sometimes easier to do business, particularly with those that don't want to be prescripted at.
Kori?
So I agree with your judgment that the president's choices are both compromising of American leadership in the world and, should he be reelected, likely to have systemic effects. But the great thing about the American political system is it is tied so tightly to public attitudes, with scheduled elections every 2 years, with state and federal competition for influence, that it's more self-correcting than many other systems. And Democrats are right to be worried. You should never underestimate the Democratic Party's ability to shoot itself in both feet simultaneously. But I think there are lots of reasons to be more optimistic than your Democratic friends were, and I'll be happy to talk about them afterwards with you.
Jonathan Paris? Yes, we'll come to you. We'll come to you.
Jonathan Paris, former Middle East Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, member of the Institute. Kori and I have been having a dialogue about deterrence in the Middle East. My question really is, with the development of precision missile by the Iranians and their willingness to deploy it all over the Middle East, most recently Yemen and Iraq, and of course Lebanon and Syria, how do you see Saudi Arabia and the Gulf on the one hand and the Israelis on the other hand avoiding a war that goes beyond the gray zone ceiling? Thank you.
So we at the Institute, over the course of the last 15 months, have been doing a huge study on Iranian influence in the Middle East. And it comes out in just a couple of weeks. I'll give you an early spoiler, though, which is that Iran's ability to work through third parties and to use militia and to undercut the control of neighboring states over their own populations has been even more important than Iran's missile capabilities, even more important than its nuclear weapons, in shaping attitudes and expanding Iran's influence beyond its territory. So it's a very real threat and concern. One of the most interesting and important findings for me in this study is that the inclusive governance that states in the Gulf began to practice as a response to public pressure during the Arab Spring has set effective limits on Iranian influence. And so I think there are lots of different ways that states in the region can react constructively to constrain Iran's influence, and I believe we already see that happening.
Thank you. In the second row, yes, if you could stand, and then thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a very rich conversation, to be honest. But what I've noticed, my question will be continuation for the gentleman's question about Iran capability. And considering that Iran is the only theological country in the region, 100%, and with its alliance with the Muslim Brothers and the rise of political Islam everywhere, whether the governments like it or not, and the spread of political Islam in Europe at the moment. I mean, we cannot deny the presence of Muslim Brothers and their strangling governments. What do you think? I mean, I'm sure it will create a chaotic situation. What do you think how to deal with that for the European as well as to stop its escalating other areas? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take a first crack at that and again refer to the book that we're launching in 9 or 10 days on Iran's influence networks in the Middle East, which does define a unique sovereign strategic capability of Iran to change the effective balance of power in the Middle East by acting through a series of partners, proxies, friends, and allies in a considered and a strategic way that is not country-specific but region general. Those relationships are very practical, they're very transactional, they're not only aimed at the so-called export of the Iranian revolution, or even principally aimed at that, but more focused on ensuring Iranian influence in a number of these regional domestic settings. There are many proponents of political Islam around the world. There are many capitals who seek to put that at the center of their external policies. There are many private actors in regional states who have those agendas, partly now being constrained by their state leaders. So the problem of political Islam is certainly not one that should be put uniquely at the foot of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because there are other countries that also have, either through state practice or through private encouragement, the spread of political Islam as an important part of their policies. What I think is true is that there is much more public debate about this, not only in Europe, not only in North America, not only in the Middle East, but also in what is now styled the Indo-Pacific, where a number of Muslim-majority countries have been alert to the extremism that has been either exported to their countries or imported through the vehicle of returning fighters into their own societies. And I would point as an example the priority that the second Jokowi presidency has in Indonesia to de-radicalization and calming the exertions of extreme political Islam in their own society. Some of these questions in the regional chapters are well rehearsed in strategic survey, so you won't be surprised that I will invite you to look at these other chapters to get a more sophisticated ISS interpretation of what the very different challenges are to international political Islam. Thanks. Here.
Thank you so much, Ali Arsalan Pasha. I'm an intern at the Institute. My question is for Dr. Chipman. Could you talk a bit more about the atomization of the global order and its rising influence of cyber warfare? Are there any strategic and security implications of an internet hegemony that is accessible by anyone around the world?
Well, the great thing about sitting on this stage is you can ask me a question and I can get an expert to answer it instead. So Nigel, Inkster, go ahead.
Yeah, on the cyber front, I mean, I think there are interesting questions about what we mean by cyber war. Nobody's ever really actually achieved a definition of this that satisfies. But I think it's a bit like true love. You kind of know it when it hits you. The fact is that state activity in the cyber domain at a level below armed conflict is undoubtedly a phenomenon that is significantly shaping the relationships between states and the power dynamic between them. And I'll give you an example. Around 2012, 2014, the United States financial system was being hit by a series of cyber attacks, none of which in and of themselves were that particularly damaging or disruptive, but which collectively sent a significant signal to the United States government from Iran, which essentially was, well, this is what we're doing. You now have to calculate whether this represents our best shot or whether it is simply, the visible tip of the iceberg. Another example is Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, where Russia essentially said, we did this, we did it. What are you going to do about it? And this kind of behavior does undoubtedly, when the injured party does not respond, that does undoubtedly shape the balance of power. The other worry about all of this, of course, is this activity is going on 24/7 in a context totally devoid of agreed rules of the road, norms of behavior, etc. There are plenty of these around, but nobody agrees on what they should be. And in respect of the major powers, the escalatory potential in the event that somebody inadvertently crosses a red line is something that is grounds for serious concern.
Thank you. Yes. If you could stand, because I can't quite see you, though I know. Yes, go ahead. Oh, yeah. Former dickhead. Go ahead.
Member of the Institute. Almost all the discussion this morning has been about state power politics, spheres of influence, quite traditional geopolitical concepts. Even 5 years ago, it's hard to think we could have got this far without more reference to international terrorism, international organized crime, the impact of the power of multinational corporations. My question is, what has happened to the non-state actors?
Good. Well, let me take the first half of that, which is that we intended in the introduction of Strategic Survey to make a statement on the nature of the international order today, because we felt that we had arrived, overused phrase, but possibly relevant today, at a genuine inflection point. And hence the powerful editorial urge to put down what we felt the mega trends actually were in terms of the international order. We hadn't sought to do so in such a determined way for the 5 or 6 years, where indeed we had talked about a number of these transnational issues. But there have been so many forces that have changed the nature of the international order and risk doing so for an enduring period of time that we felt it editorially vital to make those points. But of course, throughout the book, and generally in IISS activity, we recognize the growing force of non-state actors that in so many circumstances are able to marshal more power and or influence than our states. And one area of work in which we are also engaged is the important role of private business and corporations. And in fact, for a few years, we've been doing a lot of briefings with the private sector about how companies need to have their own foreign policy, because an absence of a foreign policy attitude in their international dealings can lead to them having all sorts of problems. And look recently at the problem that Cathay Pacific had in Hong Kong, or that other companies have had because of the way in which they have shown Taiwan on their in-flight magazines, or the way in which they have reacted to a whole host of international issues that have affected them reputationally. While there are a lot of companies this year attending the FII now in Riyadh, last year it was an act of corporate foreign policy for many of the CEOs of many of the big US companies to choose not to travel to Riyadh in October of 2019. So I think there is a big amount of work to be done, not only on the foreign policy impact that multinational corporations have in a fit of corporate absent-mindedness and as a normal function of their international commercial activities, but the foreign policy attitudes that they need more self-consciously to develop in order to protect and advance their reputations in difficult environments. Now to the classic problem of international terrorism and organized crime and the others. Nigel, have a blast at that.
Well, surprise, surprise, these things have not gone away, and in some senses, perhaps arguably, have got worse. I think transnational terrorism I think has shown itself to be something that reasonably robust states in the developed world can pretty much take in their stride. But as I think we've shown, and we've got an entire program that focuses on these issues, in the developing world, these phenomena have a disproportionate impact that is insufficiently understood and insufficiently focused on, and that is what we've been trying to do here for a couple of years. I think one area that is perhaps underappreciated is the cumulative impact of transnational organized crime, and this is perhaps less about figures in rather unlikely mouse suits stroking white Angora cats. It's a more diffuse and less focused phenomenon than that, but it is one which nonetheless has very significant damaging impacts on the economies of states. And again, it is the most vulnerable states that are disproportionately vulnerable to the destabilizing impact of such behaviors. So certainly these things have not gone away. And just to add a point on John's observations about the private sector, we see, for example, that for all the opprobrium that is currently being heaped on Mr. Zuckerberg, and much of it, I think, is much deserved. What we see is, in effect, a private sector corporation challenging the right of states to issue sovereign currencies and to maintain control of that. And that is, I think, emblematic of, if not the actual power, certainly the aspirations of some of these entities.
I would just add that the atomization isn't just the corrosion of international norms, institutions, and comfortable practices, but it's about, as Nigel suggested, the ability of states to make their territory intellectually or physically impermeable to such influences. And one of the big questions that we wrestle with at the Institute is the way the international order is changing advantageous to states' abilities to do that? And I think we are all agreed that the societies likeliest to prosper in the way these big trends are shaping the order are societies that are more porous to that kind of influence and that have the ability to capitalize on what we tend to think of as the tools of free societies.
Dominic Wilson, then Richard Bridges, and I won't forget those of you back there either. Not to worry. Dominic?
Actually, it's not Dominic, it's Peter Watkins.
Peter Watkins, I'm so sorry. Well, I'm very happy to have Peter Watkins ask a question.
Oh, right.
Much better.
So, Peter Watkins, member of the Institute.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I just build upon the earlier question about the Europeans and broaden it a little bit? Because many people argue, or some people argue, that the current circumstances that you outlined, there is a necessity and an opportunity for the so-called middle powers to work together more effectively. And by the middle powers, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Australia, etc. So do you think this is realistic? If it is, how should they best go about doing it? Or is it just another example of your wonderful phrase, Western strategic nostalgia?
Thank you very much. Well, a great champion of middle power influence in trying to sustain the rules-based order is Kori Schake, which is why she didn't want to be purposefully depressed by our opening remarks, even if the main directions were supported. So give us a shout-out, as the Americans would say, for the middle powers in this.
I think not only... I think there are lots of opportunities, and I think middle powers are limbering themselves up to capitalize on them, in part because they are so fearful about the ebbing away of American willingness and, in some cases, ability to manage these trends in the international order. The country that I think is making the most interesting choices right now is actually Japan. We are doing a lot of work on Japan at the Institute. And if you think about the way Japan is, for example, training the Coast Guards of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, countries that are worried about Chinese encroachment on their territorial waters. The Japanese government is helping improve the capacity of those states and cascading equipment to them. If you look at the way Japan, Korea, South Korea, Canada, Australia brought the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership into being without American participation in order to buy time for the reconsideration of the United States. The Europeans have done a fabulous job, actually, at managing a lot of Gazprom's worst tendencies by using the regulatory framework and law of the European Union. So I think there are lots of examples, and they're just beginning to get momentum.
Nick?
Yeah, I agree with all that. Let me offer another thought, which is that I think right now in part of middle powers, there's a certain hesitation. There's a reluctance to believe that actually the United States is now on a permanent new course rather than that it might spring back. I mean, if you look at Trump's broadly transformational agenda, yes, on trade, he's really turned things upside down. And it's very difficult now to find sort of pro-WTO enthusiasts within say, Congress. But on question of alliance politics, US leadership, that's different. And there are very different views still. And so that debate hasn't been won. And I think that's a good reason for others not to push too far ahead in case it would encourage trends in the United States that aren't in favor. So give them a chance. Wait for the opportunities. I'd also see whether the United States will recalibrate somewhat.
Yeah, I think it's a close call now whether the middle powers in Asia or the middle powers in Europe are the ones that are trying to shape their regional orders more effectively. I think it's interesting that Indonesia was able to get ASEAN to accept the term Indo-Pacific recently, which is a phrase that encapsulates a sense of a multipolar Asia, which the Asia-Pacific term, which was previously the accepted phraseology, did not. And it is, I think, interesting that Australia, who has its biggest economic relationship with China, but its most important strategic relationship with the United States, is trying to box diplomatically cleverly within that region. And perhaps there are some lessons that the Middle European powers can learn from that current exercise of diplomatic courage by Australia. There is a young lady right in the back, and I don't want to be geographically prejudiced. So right in the back, please. Thank you very much.
From Crisis Action. I was interested in hearing what you talked a lot about atomization and fragmentation, and was keen to hear what you think that means for conflict resolution and where and how that happens, because obviously that was previously the purview of the UN, the Security Council. We've seen the Security Council increasingly stymied. You're seeing groups like IGAD being being the locus of conflict resolution in South Sudan. Individual or bilateral initiatives in Syria, say. So are you likely to see conflict resolution also atomizing, or is there a risk that you're getting kind of these different competing interests coming in, and that meaning that we're going to see more protracted conflicts?
Thank you very much. Well, I'll just draw a link between the last question and yours before inviting the head of our Conflict Security and Development Program, Virginia Comley, to offer a few thoughts on that. But the link that I want to draw is that it was quite interesting that in the last week or so, the German defense minister talked about the aspiration of having an international force deploy into northern Syria, effectively to mediate between the ambitions of Russia, Turkey, and a number of other important states. And of course, there was an intramural debate in Europe with the French standing up asking, well, where are your troops and what are you actually going to do about it? So there is still an instinct to engage in conflict resolution, but the degree to which that's backed up either with the capability or the political will to deploy forces in difficult circumstances is open to question. Virginia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, as you rightly pointed out, especially over the past few years, UN missions have been increasingly scrutinized, and we've seen across the world, but especially across the African continent, how ad hoc groupings and regional organizations have actually taken the lead in dealing with some of these security challenges. So what we are seeing more and more is a combination of UN missions, ad hoc missions, and missions led by different regional organizations. Of course, the strength, professionalism, and resources of some of these groupings may vary, and oftentimes they rely heavily on the financial support of traditional Western sponsors. But what we are seeing also is that new actors are taking a greater role, especially on the African continent, in conflict resolution. And I'm sure you'll find one of the essays within this year's strategic survey particularly interesting, because it really looks in detail into the role played by a number of Gulf countries in East Africa.
Anything else? Yes, you in the second row, and then you, and then we'll close with that. Thank you.
Hello, a student of political economy of the Middle East here at King's College London. Now, I have 3 questions because...
You're not allowed to have 3 questions, because I have Richard Bridges and another person here, but pick your best question.
All right, I'll make it a quick one. With the Israelis potentially coming into far more extreme right-wing politics, and with the whole of the Israeli public seemingly endorsing the annexation of the West Bank, how do you see it potentially playing out in destabilizing countries in the region near Israel?
Thank you very much. We'll collect the last 2, and then we'll all come back. So, Richard?
Thank you very much, Richard Bridge from BP. It's about Russia and China. You've all spoken eloquently about them. Can they team up, or have they already teamed up? Thank you.
And over here.
Hi, Alex Walsh, consultant on security sector reform in the Middle East. My question, there are 2 potential transitions happening on Europe's doorstep in Algeria and possibly Lebanon. What can Europe do differently to support these transitions?
Thank you very much. Nigel first, then Nick, and then Kori, and then we'll close with that.
Okay, I'll take the one on Russia, China. Have they partnered up? And I think the answer is yes, to a significant degree. We've seen over the last few years both countries putting a lot of effort into developing this relationship, a lot of ministerial committees meeting on a regular basis, Putin and Xi Jinping meeting, 4 or 5 times a year on a regular basis. And I think what we have got is a situation in which both parties recognize that Russia is the junior partner here, but China does not rub their noses in this fact. And obviously what brings these 2 powers together more than anything is a mutual desire to constrain the political leverage of the United States, and I think that they are getting quite good at finding ways in which to do this. But there are limits to the depth of this relationship. I think both parties recognize where those limits are and are doing everything they can to navigate around them.
Nick?
I'll let Dana Allen in a moment talk a little bit about Israel, but Russia, China, yes, I think they've teamed up, but I think it's a coalition, not an alliance. And I don't think it will endure, but they have plenty in common right now. But there are quite important differences between the 2, whether you look in terms of China, for instance, I think tolerates the fact that Russia seems to want to cross the road right now to try and cause the United States pain. That's not China's MO. And the Russians, their own part, have obviously got, as you note, a huge dilemma. How do you avoid a position of subservience? Because the pivot to Asia has happened. It's a deepening, if we can use the EU parlance, but Russia really needs to do a widening quite soon. There's already elements of that started, the negotiations with India, the fact that they're actually prepared to sell submarines to Vietnam, even though we know who they're most likely to be used against. But there are many more steps, I think, that will probably need to be taken.
And you're right, Dana Allen on the domestic politics of Israel and how it affects the region, and then last word to Kori.
Yeah, I think that I forget where the question came from, the possibility of an irreversible end to the prospect of a two-state solution is, one emblem of what John Chipman was talking about in terms of the atomization of international society and the recession of American interest or determination to enforce a kind of values-based foreign policy, not just in terms of its adversaries, but in terms of its allies as well. Now, you could argue that the United States has not been hugely effective in promoting a peace process and sort of the incubation of a Palestinian state, but it's been very adamant about it, and it's been working on it. Well, that's a matter of disagreement, but it's been working on it for a long time, and it's actually been fairly consistent. That consistency has ended with this administration, and as to prospects, Israel itself is going to have to come to grips with. If we're right that this is irreversible, Israel is going to have to come to grips with the implications of a one-state solution, which are obviously bring a lot of problems with it.
Kori Schake.
So let me just say in closing, it is a measure of how much is intellectually interesting and important in this book that I didn't even recall that there was a chapter on 5G issues in it. It's a wonderful, rich, intellectually stimulating book, and I encourage you all to read it.
Thank you, everybody. And I don't want to forget the important point made about Algeria and Lebanon. We are looking a great deal at the importance, of course, of European engagement in its own near abroad that certainly includes Algeria and Lebanon, and I think there'll be a couple of strategic comments coming out on those very questions quite soon. But thank you, all of you, for coming this morning, and we look forward to carrying on the conversations.